Randomness is a touchy topic for people who play games, and understandably so. It can be quite frustrating to have your intricately thought-out plan fall apart simply because the dice did not come up in your favor. And I will be the first to criticize a game that is far too luck-based to actually strategize in. Risk. Ahem. Sorry. When used in the wrong way, randomness can make a game feel arbitrary and pointless. Scenarios where a clearly superior player is defeated by someone who has no idea what they're doing can be one of the most frustrating things in gaming, and many gamers, at least in the video game world, are ready to write off RNG entirely. However, randomness is just like any other tool in the designer's tool belt. It can be used to both improve or to harm a game. Today, we're looking at randomness in games, specifically in Armello, a game that provides an interesting take on randomness in game design. For those of you who have not heard of Armello, it is a video game released on PC and PlayStation. However, it is trying to emulate the feeling of playing a traditional board game. This means that there are lots of cards and dice, which are both staples of many tabletop games. Having these sorts of elements will generally insert a lot of randomness into your game, so designers need to be very thoughtful when designing mechanics using cards and dice. Fortunately, because cards and dice are such staples of tabletop gaming, tabletop designers have gotten very good at creating mechanics that effectively use the random natures of cards and dice. But before I dive into the specifics of Armello, I want to discuss the benefits that randomness can bring to a game. Believe it or not, there are many things that randomness is good for. For instance, randomness allows more players to play games in which it is implemented in. Let's take chess as an example. Suppose a very young kid and Garry Kasparov were to sit down and play a game of chess. The game would be disappointing for both players. The young kid wouldn't enjoy his time because he would be absolutely crushed by Garry, without even a sliver of hope that he might beat him. Why would he even play if he has no chance of winning? Kasparov wouldn't be enjoying himself either, unless he's some sort of psychopath that takes pleasure from crushing the dreams of young children. More likely, he would just be bored, since he would have to exert practically no effort to win the game. In order to get the most enjoyment out of a very deterministic game, you ideally need to play someone at about your skill level. However, games with random elements are more accessible to players of a wider skill level, which is great if you want to play a game with your friends or family, even if they aren't super good at games. Randomness also adds variety to a game. Let's look at chess again to see what I mean. In chess, the opening moves are some of the most studied parts of the game, since it is by far one of the most important parts. However, high-level chess players seldom deviate from the core series of memorized chess openings that have been memorized and studied by both players. Chess has about 4,000 unique openings that have been used since 1850. However, the top 30 openings are used in about 70% of chess games. Because chess has no inbuilt randomness and has existed for hundreds of years, high-level chess games become more about how many openings you have memorized, at least until you enter the mid-game, where players have not memorized every possible series of moves. Many other highly deterministic games, such as Go and StarCraft, also suffer from this problem of players memorizing optimal moves or reducing the amount of time it takes to execute a particular strategy. Randomness, however, can be a great way to add variety to a game, and many games have used it to great effect. Games like XCOM 2 randomly generate maps and enemy placement for every mission, removing the ability for players to memorize specific tactics. Instead, players are encouraged to think tactically on their feet because they cannot rely on pre-developed strategies. This form of randomness allows a wider array of strategies to become possible. Now that we have looked at some of the advantages of randomness, it is important that we also look at some of the negatives of randomness. Sometimes, random factors can make players feel as if they've been cheated out of a deserved victory. We've all had that game of Mario Kart where We're on the home stretch of the track when the dreaded beep of the blue shell pops out of nowhere and ruins our day. Randomness can also make the player's choices feel less meaningful and impactful because their successes and failures do not always feel earned or deserved. So now that we've laid the groundwork of randomness, let's look at how Armello has designed its randomness. Much like XCOM 2, Armello randomly generates a map before the game begins. While the map is randomly generated, the players have been given all of the information about movement before they decide to move. Essentially, when a player travels to a forest tile, the tile will not randomly transform into a swamp when the player decides to move there. This is unlike most of the other sources of randomness in Armello, in which the outcome of an event cannot be predicted before you make your decision. Keith Bergen calls these two kinds of randomness input and output randomness. Input randomness is randomness that informs the player of the outcome before the player is required to choose. Randomly generated levels in a roguelike game are good examples of input randomness. The levels are random, but the effects of the level are mostly deterministic. The blocks in Spelunky will not move position unless the player acts upon them with a bomb or something. The other kind of randomness Keith presents is output randomness, which is a random factor that cannot be predicted before the effect of the randomness takes place. You cannot predict exactly how an encounter in Armello will pan out until the chips are down and the dice are rolled. Both kinds of randomness will provide the advantages of randomness that I laid out earlier in the video. However, backlash against input randomness is far less than the backlash against output randomness, so for the remainder of the video, I will be talking primarily about the output randomness found in Armello. Let's start with the cards. In a lot of card games, players will draw resources from a single deck. In Magic the Gathering, players will receive their land, spell, and creature cards all from the same deck. However, because all of the players' resources come from the same place, randomness is very hard to control. Let's look at a practical example to see what I'm talking about. Let's say you are playing a game of Magic, and you did not draw many land cards, so you really would like to draw a land so you could field some larger creatures. You have a problem though. Since every card you draw comes from the same place, you could get the land you need, or you could draw a creature or spell that might not be as useful to you at the moment. If you didn't get a card that would be useful for you, then that turn's draw was effectively worthless. Armello, however, gives the player more control over how they draw their cards. Unlike Magic the Gathering, Armello has 3 draw piles, each of them with a very specific kind of card. The item deck is filled primarily with equipable cards purchased either with gold or rot. The magic deck is filled only with spell cards that can be purchased using magic or rot. And the trickery deck is filled mostly with action cards purchased using gold or rot. Because the cards are sorted into 3 different draw piles based on their characteristics, the player can choose to draw from the different piles based on their current needs, ultimately giving the player more control over the randomness of drawing cards. If the player has not equipped 3 items yet, they can immediately get item cards into their hand without having to drudge through treachery and spell cards. If a player has no mana, they will not have their inventory filled with spell cards that are useless to them. The players still don't have complete control over their draws, but they still have more control over their draws than if they drew all the cards from the same deck. There are other tools the designers have built into the game that give the player more ways to control the randomness of the draw decks. Players can increase their wit, which allows them to hold more cards in their hand at once, and therefore have more opportunities to draw cards which increase the odds of finding something useful. Armello's card draw system also differs from games like Hearthstone and Magic. In those games, the player only draws 1 card at the start of their turn, no matter how many cards they have in their hand. On the other hand, Armello allows players to draw back up to their hand limit at the start of their turn. Usually this means that players will draw more cards over the course of a game of Armello as opposed to Magic the Gathering, and therefore have more chances to get the cards they need. This system of drawing up to your hand limit also helps to feed into the burn mechanic, and of course, this does not guarantee that the player will find what they need, or even that the cards they drew will be useful. However, even if a card's ability is useful to you, there is still a very good chance that you would be able to use the card. That is because of a clever bit of design found in the burn system. But before we can talk about that, we need to talk about how the dice work in Armello. When you think of a dice, there's a decent chance you picture a cube with faces that have increasing numbers on each face. This is a very standard dice, so it is often the go-to dice that most tabletop developers will gravitate towards when looking to add dice mechanics to their game. Most designers will use dice as a random number generator that will spit out a random number between 1 and 6. However, recently, some game designers have changed the basic design of a dice, throwing out the idea that dice are just random number generators, and instead giving each face a unique ability that cannot be quantified fully, at least not in the way that they could before. Richard Garfield's King of Tokyo is a good example of this. For those of you not familiar with the game, each player plays a monster fighting for control of Tokyo. All of the actions the players can take are represented by the 6 faces of the dice, each of which has a completely different effect than the other. The claw symbol deals damage to your opponents. The heart lets you recover health. The lightning bolt gives you energy which you can use to buy cards, and the other 3 provide points if you get 3 of a kind. Unlike regular dice in other games, every face in the King of Tokyo dice provides advantages that provide bonuses none of the other faces can provide. Compare this to Risk, where each of the faces do the same thing, but just some of them happen to do it better. Armello has abandoned traditional dice in favor of dice that can be better suited to fit the game's design. So let's break down Armello's dice in combat. Each sword face will deal 1 point of damage to your opponent, and a shield will block a point of damage from your opponent. Then there are the sun and moon faces, which will count as an attack or a miss depending on the time of day. During the day, the sun will always count as an attack, and the moon will always count as a miss. And the opposite is true during the night. And finally, there are the wild and rot symbols. If the player has not corrupted themselves, the wild symbol will count as an attack and explode, granting the player an additional dice. The rot symbol, on the other hand, will count as a miss. However, once the player has more than 5 rot, the functions of the rot and wild faces are reversed. Because the relative power of each of the dice faces are a lot closer than the relative power of a traditional dice, the strongest and weakest results are a lot closer in power than with a normal dice. When breaking down the probabilities of each result, you find that a dice will have a 3 in 6 chance to deal damage to your opponent, a 1 in 6 chance to block an attack, a 2 in 6 chance to miss, and a 1 in 6 chance to explode. There is an interesting property of dice that reveals itself once you start looking at the total amount of dice being rolled. According to statistics, the more dice you roll, the less random the results will be. This might seem a bit counterintuitive at first, since dice are the personification of randomness, so shouldn't adding more of them make the result more random? Well, think about a dice. There is a 1/6 chance that any particular face will be rolled. If you roll that dice once, the face that came up will make up 100% of the results, and all of the other dice will be 0% of the total rolls. However, if you were to keep rolling this dice over and over again, these percentages would even out over time. Sure, you might roll a lot of one face at the start, but that is to be expected with randomness. The more the dice are rolled, the closer each face will get to its statistical average. So in Armello, if you only have a couple of dice, it is a lot harder to predict your roll than rolling a whole handful of dice, which are going to be more aligned with the statistical average than a couple of dice. If you haven't noticed from the footage I've been showing in the background, Armello has a lot of dice, and this means that on the whole, the end results will be a lot closer to the statistical average. Not all of the characters have high amounts of dice for combat, such as Sena, who without any bonuses has 2 fight, which gives her 2 dice in combat. However, this is on the low end, and the average fight stat is 3.75 without any bonuses. Gaining more dice will give you a combat advantage, and Armello provides players many ways to be rewarded with dice, such as Clan Affinity bonus, which gives you an extra dice depending on the time of day, gaining dice for a rot battle, and many other ways the players can manipulate the odds in their favor. Compare this to something like Risk, which can only change your chances of capturing a tile by throwing more men at it, and you only get more men by controlling more territory, or specific territory, or by turning in cards. That's it. There is one very unpredictable part of the dice that can completely ruin your day if you get unlucky. Because dice could explode forever, theoretically, players' attack strength will always have a small chance to kill anyone, no matter how much health, equipment, or dice they have. This can make combat a lot harder to control, and in turn it makes combat a bit more random. Explosions aren't all bad though. They do help to ratchet up the tension of every encounter, because even if you can probably attack someone without dying, there is always a small chance that they will get more attacks than you anticipated. And this brings us back to the burn system, which in my opinion is one of the greatest mechanics to fight randomness I have ever seen in a board game. So how does it work? Every card the player draws has one of the 6 dice symbols. Before rolling dice in a combat encounter, both players have an opportunity to burn cards. Burning a card discards it from your hand, but in return you get to turn one of your dice to the symbol on the card. The system gives the player a lot of control over how the dice will turn up, and can even eliminate randomness entirely if you burn enough cards. Not only does burning help you control the randomness of the dice to get the precise result that you want, but it also goes a long way to reduce the frequency of dead draws. If a card's written text is not useful, you will still get some use out of it to guarantee combat rolls, or to pass a peril. Burning is a simple way to clear your hand of cards that you might not want to or be able to play. Since every card has 2 uses, its written ability and its burn ability, the likelihood that a card is completely useless is greatly reduced. Items and followers also give players more control over the randomness. Each of the items gives a player a guaranteed advantage, meaning that players who spend money for better equipment will help counterbalance the randomness brought about by the combat system. If the randomness does not go in the player's favor, the penalty of failing a combat encounter is not game ruining, at least not in the early parts of the game. Even if a player loses an encounter, they aren't guaranteed death, and they will just be routed to a nearby hex. If a player does happen to die though, they will not lose the game, and instead they are sent back to their spawn and lose a prestige point. While this can be annoying, and late in the game it can mean that you don't have enough time to pull out a victory, a skilled player can still claim victory if they play their cards right. Armello doesn't always get its random elements right though. The Stranger is a follower that players can find in a dungeon. At the start of their turn, the Stranger moves the player in a random direction, which will waste the player's time getting back on course. Unlike every other form of randomness in Armello though, players have no way that they can effectively play around this randomness or use it to help control the odds. Burning cards helps you control the combat, but there is no equivalent to burning a card to help you manipulate the Stranger's movement. And the Stranger does not lead to interesting scenarios either. When your opponent rolls 5 exploding dice and kills you right before you fight the king, this might be annoying, but at least it is an interesting and exciting story. The Stranger is just sort of annoying, and he just gets in the way of your plans and isn't really a fun challenge to deal with. However, because he is so rare, he doesn't completely ruin the balance of the game. In conclusion, randomness is just like any other design tool. There are good and bad uses for it. It is important to remember that random does not mean without skill, and developers can design randomness to force players to calculate odds and weigh risks in a way that requires skillful play. Armello, though not perfect, has handled its randomness very well, and has some valuable lessons on how to implement randomness in your game. Firstly, if your game has randomness, it is important that designers give players ways to balance the odds in their favor. Otherwise, players' decisions will feel arbitrary and negate the advantages randomness can provide. It also helps if the designer ensures that having a bad roll will not completely ruin your chances of winning the game. Randomness is a huge topic, and this is just one game's take on developing random systems that emulate tabletop-inspired games. There's a lot of stuff about randomness I left out of this video, but I would like to revisit it at some point in the future. Until then, like and subscribe if you want to see more content of this kind. That would really help me out. Also, feel free to comment. I would love to hear your thoughts about randomness in games, how it's used, examples you don't like, some examples you like, how you feel Armello uses it, talk about tabletop gaming, talk about video games, just whatever. Just engagement is more fun for everybody, because I get to hear your responses, and that's good. But until next time, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.